The hurricane has spawned numerous tornadoes already today across Central and South Florida. This video showing just a few of them. At one point, 19 tornado warnings were in effect at one time, with over a dozen reports from the Storm Prediction Center's Storm Reports page already. That tornado threat continuing through the night. We continue our Milton coverage, joined live by News 4's White House correspondent Jon Decker. So, John, President Biden getting updates throughout the day as Hurricane Milton barrels toward Florida. What did the president say FEMA is doing right now ahead of landfall?
The president in the past 30 minutes giving an update to reporters, talking about how Milton will likely be what he called a catastrophic event for the state of Florida. The president spoke about how there is an unprecedented amount of resources, food, 20 million meals, water, generators, medicine, and of course personnel that has already been pre-positioned in Florida ahead of Milton making landfall. In addition to that, Kinsley, you also have military assets also being pre-positioned in terms of search and rescue teams once Milton makes landfall.
So, John, what was the president's message about misinformation concerning the hurricane?
Well, it wasn't just about misinformation, Kinsley. It was also about disinformation. This is the second day in a row that the president has spoken about this. He said that any individual that provides that disinformation in terms of what resources are available to them through the Federal Emergency Management Agency or through state emergency management agencies is acting in an un-American fashion. The president said it's important to get critically important, true information to those who are in the pathway of Hurricane Milton and those dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Helene.
Jon Decker, that's our time, but thanks for joining us today on News 4 at 5.